So, Mondo, we're talking about the DNA results. You and I have been down to Peru numerous times. You were the archaeologist who created the paperwork, dare I say, that took us years to get, but we got the actual permits. And then, of course, we find out after the fact that, oh, well, we could just take samples from a private museum. You didn't need the permits. It was just like unbelievable. All of a sudden, we get this call from, I won't mention the guy's name, but from the archaeologist down in Peru, and he gives us this little window.
Well, that was like 3 years later.
3 years later.
Yeah, it was 3 years later that we get this window.
Right.
Yeah.
Out of the blue. Okay, you've been approved, but you got this window. Come down and take the samples.
Within it was like 6 weeks. Get it all done in 6 weeks.
Yeah, and we did.
Yep.
We went down there, and we fly into Peru, and we landed in Lima. Of course, we stayed there, and then we went out to. We had a driver, and we went out to the ICA Museum, and we met their archaeologists there. And describe what happens when we get there. The museum was closed, if you recall, and we had 4 people. So we had Mondo Gonzales, the late Richard Shaw, who filmed everything for us, my ex-business partner, and Chase Klotsky, who flagged and tagged all the samples, and of course yours truly. So now we're at the ICA Museum. Pick up a story from there.
Yeah, what was fascinating to me is that we were looking for permission for the private museum. But then when they saw our project, they were like, well, hey, since you're going to be down here and you're going to be doing some extractions from the private museum, we will offer you 10 skulls from their Ica regional museum. Mm-hmm. It was, it's a regional museum of the National Lima Museum. So when we walk in, they have room set up for us, and they had brought out 10 of their skulls. Just
Right.
They have thousands of them, as you know, and so they wanted some DNA testing on very specific skulls. So we got the provenance of those skulls, put them in our report. But interesting, I don't know in the sense of the details of what they were doing, but most of their skulls were expected. They were haplogroup B, nothing to see here.
Stop right there. When you say haplogroup B, why is that important, and what does it mean?
So in genetics you have different haplogroups or people groups that in ancient times. Well, B is the letter that they assign towards really indigenous peoples that came across from
the Bering Strait,
Mongolia. That
Right.
So you have this idea of them coming down and populating all through, and so it's very clear. So you just if you took an average Native American and you just said, give me your haplogroup, they would come up with that. So that was half of their skulls, 5 out of the 10 came up with that. But they had 3, one of them we couldn't test, it was just completely degraded. But the other one that they had was anomalous. And so that's really what we say anomalous, we talk about rewriting history because it goes against expectation.
Exactly.
So that was their skulls, their old provenance. Of course, we had ours in the sense of the private museum, but that was really the goal. But we came in there, it was like CSI. I mean, we had all the protocols perfectly dialed in. We had suits, we changed suits, we made sure
for every skull we changed suits.
Yeah, for every skull. So I think we did maybe 3 at a time. I don't remember because that was we had 10, but nevertheless,
my recollection is 1 skull at a time,
and then we wouldn't change it.
And then we wouldn't change, yeah.
So
because we had I think 40 lab suits to change,
and
that's lab suits.
That's the key because there's the accusation that it's contaminated,
right.
But that's why we went to these nth degrees. But secondly, we also gave our DNA, because and most of the DNA. We may talk about that for a minute, that you have mitochondrial DNA and then you have the nuclear DNA, which is the father side. The mitochondrial is the mother side. So, but there's so much more mitochondrial DNA than the nuclear DNA.
Right.
And so we didn't get any of the nuclear, which is really what we wanted. We wanted to have the full lineage of the paternal side and the maternal side, which we didn't. So for our DNA, clearly, you would get father
nuclear,
and mother.
Yeah,
you would get nuclear. So we didn't
right.
get nuclear of anything, which means, again, our DNA wasn't found in there to contaminate it. But even on the maternal side, that's how we were able still to determine the haplogroups. And again, we had 18 skulls, 58 samples. We had bone, we had hair, we had teeth, we had pieces of bone. So we tried to be redundant, not only in the type of material that we had, but also, as you know, clearly for the different labs. And we did it blind. That was the key to see that lab with that particular piece of bone and that lab with the bone or maybe hair. They
Something
came back
different, the same.
They came back the same haplogroup. Yep.
And this guy here was tested at 3 different labs. This is the baby skull, 2,000 years old, 1,956 years, carbon-14 dating. And it's funny now, the lab that was doing the carbon-14, because they know who we are, now they call it pseudoscience. It's unbelievable. What's
their own work? I mean, they're the ones giving us the report. Yeah.
I mean, all we're doing is taking the mummy wrappings and flagging and tagging it and sending it off to the lab. How is it pseudoscience?
Yeah.
And we have a definite age, 2,000 years, and this guy here came back U2E1, 3 different labs, which is Eastern European, which rewrites history. There is no contamination. And I want to thank, Senior Juan Navarro when he was alive. I mean, that's where we first laid eyes on the baby, and that's where we took the samples from. Of course, Brian Forrester. Without Brian's work on YouTube, we wouldn't have even known about it. So our hats off to both men, and Senior Juan has passed away. But it was Rick Woodward who really opened the door on the genetic disposition or the genetic anomalies of these skulls. And I want you to take this guy and show us what Rick's what Rick really discovered.
So there's the genetics, which they stand for themselves. It's a whole line of evidence. But there's also what Rick saw as an anthropologist. He's looking at the skull itself for morphological, really what we would say.
The morphology of the skull.
Yeah, the morphology of the skull.
The way it's structured.
So what he did is he comes and he looks and says, hey, that foramen magnum is not supposed to really be there. It's supposed to be a little farther up. Very human. You take a human skull, it's supposed to be centered. But you can see if we just do this, that there's no. Like that.
There you go.
There it is. That it's so far back on the skull that this is actually a genetic difference. That we there's no doubt, as you know as well. We looked at headboarding, and we're not denying that cranial headboarding.
Yeah, headboarding exists. They did that.
They did it.
Right.
But you don't wrap a child's skull and cause the foramen magnum to move all the way.
All the way.
You would. I mean, I have neck issues. I know you would squeeze the spinal cord. You just can't do it.
Yeah.
You just can't do it. So that's what Rick discovered. Not only that, but he discovered several other things as it relates to the eyes and the
very, very pronounced zygomatic arch here.
And the condyles were underneath here, was a lot thicker too. So we have 2 lines here, which is the actual changes of the skull showing something anomalous. And then we have the DNA, which is interesting as well, that it's showing this transatlantic contribution to the gene pool. And they've done many. There's other archaeologists that have done work down in the Paracas area as well as Nazca, comparing elongated skulls. And we tried to reach out to them and say, hey, I know you guys did some genetic studies. Were they elongated? And so, but they don't want to share. But maybe you're willing to share that the work that we've done. You shared with me that they're still the secular people are still paying attention to it.
I was at a conference, in fact, the Prophecy Watchers conference in Orlando last year. This year, what am I saying? It's still 2023. I'm already into 2024, but I digress. So I'm at the conference, and a gentleman came up to the table. He introduced himself, and he said, I want you to know I'm a microbiologist. Okay, that's interesting. And then he kind of leaned forward. There was nobody else at the table, just this gentleman. And he goes, I want you to know something, that your work on the Paracas skulls, your DNA evidence, and what you're proposing has sent ripples through academia. People are afraid to talk about it, but behind closed doors, they will talk about it with one another. So I'm going to spill the beans on something which I have not yet done and I'm going to do it today. We have a bona fide geneticist who's retesting some of our samples, and I'll just leave it at that. And what we're trying to do is work up a full-blown genome, not just the haplogroups, but the whole thing. So more about that. It's the first I've mentioned it, but it's interesting. Now people talk about this as pseudoscience, but It really isn't, because our hypothesis was this, if you recall, that the Paracas people show up in Peru about 3,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, somewhere in that window, give or take a few hundred years, and that corresponds with the diaspora of the Nephilim tribes when Joshua and Caleb go into the Promised Land and start eradicating them. And you taught me this, you showed me that the stele in North Africa from Procopius saying that we are they who fled from the face of Joshua, the son of Nun the robber. So what's that doing there? So we know there's this diaspora. Our hypothesis was, is it possible that these elongated skulls were, one, came from the Middle East, came from a Levant, and two, is it possible that they were Nephilim? And so that was our hypothesis. And so far, things have turned out with the DNA evidence showing that there's definitely a Middle Eastern connection.
Yeah, I think that the assumption sometimes, and even for all of us, is that the Nephilim are always giants, and that's not the case.
It's not the case.
The definition of a Nephilim is the offspring, again, of a fallen angel and a human woman. So what we see, the key big picture is that you have an interruption in normal human genetics. So you have an outside influence, a supernatural influence. That's the key, is that when the fallen
they're
angels,
mixing the seed.
They're mixing. They're coming in, the sons of God come in, and they're introducing a foreign element, which is exactly what Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2, 4.
Exactly, sure.
It's introducing
Quote the Jude passage.
The Jude is that it was strange, you have strange flesh.
Right, going after strange flesh.
And that they left their proper abode and their domain. So you have their authority. They have a domain that they're allowed to be in. Well, they went out of that. But they also, you see that not only do you have a realm change. They crossed over a realm that they were not allowed to be in, and they went after strange flesh. The thing about Jude 6 and 7 is it uses two words that are connectors in the Greek, likewise, in the same manner.
He's connecting the two thoughts. Absolutely.
And so he's saying, hey, in the same way that you saw at Sodom and Gomorrah, as it relates to sexual perversion, going after strange or unallowed. That's, again, as in the biblical frame, as a man, I'm not allowed to go after another man. I can, but I'm not allowed.
Right.
And that's what Jude is saying, is in the same way that you have the sin of homosexuality, they were going against something that was not allowed. The angels could, but they were not allowed, but they did. Just like today, you have a man going after man. They do. And so that's really what we see, is this introduction into the uncontaminated human genome, something from the outside. So what we see now in these skulls is we see some anomalies as it relates to the genetics coming from Eastern Europe and others. Because, as you know, when you go to the Caucasus region, they have elongated skulls. They find their own elongated skulls. Yeah. So it's interesting there that were those part of the Nephilim tribes that made their way over and then introduced that genetic marker into the indigenous culture of Peru or really Western South America.
Mingling of the seed.
Yeah, so we have not only the transatlantic, but also the morphological changes that Rick discovered.
And they are here.
They're here.
Indisputable. Yep. It's incredible what we discovered there. In our opinion, it does rewrite history. And I've had yet, the naysayers will always go up there. We won't mention any names, but they'll say, Marzulli and his team of loons. I'll just leave it at that, which is just an incredibly insulting, demeaning thing to say. You're looking at people with PhDs, people that have spent years in the field, anthropologists, archaeologists. That film, we've got medical doctors, optometrists, archaeologists, anthropologists, just an optometrist who look at the eyes, and he was the first guy ever to do that, as far as I'm aware of. And he talked about that the orbits are 25 to 30% larger than a normal skull. That's just the beginning of it. So, we've done due diligence. So instead of a name calling the ad hominem attacks, which is just a low blow, do your own research. Tell us why this zygomatic arch is the way it is. Tell us why the foramen magnum is all the way to the posterior of the skull, because these are morphological oddities. These are genetic aberrations that are not part of the human genome. And of course, for a lot of the naysayers because they do not believe in the biblical narrative, so they have to lash out at this. Gary Stearman, Prophecy Watchers, elder brother Gary, talked about this years ago, Genesis 3:15, and he expounded on that. So there you go, folks. There's lots of resources on our site. Also, Prophecy Watchers. Mondo, I'll give you the last word, and thanks for coming on the record.
Yeah, I think that when we look at these, people say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we messing with the elongated schools? Well, what we're showing here, what the evidence is showing, is that there has been a tampering of the genetic thing, of the human genetic population, the gene pool, which is consistent with Genesis 6. So what we're seeing here, this is direct evidence of the principle that we see introduced in the biblical text. That's why it's so amazing and so important, because again, in Joshua 11, you see this where verses 21 through 23, the idea of the Nephilim fleeing west.
Right.
It says they fled west there into the basically the Gaza, the same things that we see going on today.
Really interesting, right?
The Pentapolis of the Philistine cities. But as you mentioned, Procopius continuing to go, and maybe even
into North Africa.
Yeah, or even north into Caucasus region.
Yeah, absolutely. Or into the Mediterranean, island hopping, which I believe we have evidence of, and then into Europe and finally over here.